Welcome everyone to episode 61 of Talk to Your Meeting Doctors. Today's conversation takes us beyond meetings themselves and into something much deeper, the quality of human interaction in everyday working life. Our guest today is Steve Neale, and he will invite us to reflect on emotional intelligence, not as a soft skill, but a foundation leadership capability. I hope you're going to enjoy the session, led as usual by my co host, Martin Duffy, my esteemed PhD colleague. Welcome back, Steve. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's good to be here. It's been some years, so I'm very much looking forward to today's session.
Yeah, it's been a long time, Steve, but you might recall the first with our guests. If there's anything particularly from your background or your past that happy to share with us, but that a lot of people might not be familiar with, and have be related to anything in particular, or just something that's interesting from your past experiences.
Bizarrely, a very odd one came to mind. Way back in my early career in my 20s, I got my first big corporate gig. I was living and working in Denmark at the time, and I was working with, I believe, the largest shipping container company in the world, AP Muller. And that was quite a prestigious gig. They had a very formal dress code, and you had to wear a certain color shirt. I think it was either blue or white. And I got this gig to do I think it was a presentation skills course with some new apprentices. Very, very formal. I was a little bit nervous. And I noticed on the morning of the session that the fly on my trousers, the bit that covers over the zip, was bent backwards. So I, with my brilliant ideas last minute, decided to put a clothes peg over it to try to fold it back so it didn't look odd. And then I got on my bike, because it's almost mandatory to cycle around Copenhagen. Arrived at AP Muller, and of course I completely forgot that I was actually wearing a clothes peg in a slightly unfortunate area, and walked out in front of 30 new apprentices ready to make a big impression with, I think it was a green colored clothes peg on my fly. So I don't know where that came from, but that's that's a true story. And actually, it ended up being quite a brilliant icebreaker.
Yeah, kind of.
So there we go.
Yeah. It must have been a bit of emotional intelligence required from the audience to appreciate that one, Steve.
I don't know. It was definitely an interesting experience, especially for what was then a relatively young man in my early 20s. Yeah, so... Anyhow, that's what came to mind. I have no idea where it came from, but that's what
I love it. I love it. It's our chosen theme or topic today, Steve, is one that you've told us you've worked in this area for the last 30 odd years, and it's the whole concept of emotionally intelligent leadership in organizations. But a little bit of the theme or the topic. I mean, the very first question that I'd ask is, do we have a shared understanding of what emotional intelligence actually is? How would you define emotional intelligence?
So the shortest definition that I've heard, which makes perfect sense, and then I'll go on to explain it, is emotional intelligence is being intelligent about your emotions. And that sounds pretty simple, but essentially it comes down to the teamwork between different parts of our brain. So we've got the prefrontal cortex. I often refer to it as the rider. It's the rational brain, it's the cognitive brain, it's the intellectual brain, it's the so-called in terms of traditional academic definitions, intelligent brain. And then you've got the emotional driver. It's the subconscious brain. It's the elephant. It's the part of the brain that when it gets triggered by external stimuli, generates an emotional response within milliseconds, sends that emotion throughout the body as a physical sensation, a physiological change. And if we allow it to, will then go on to impact on our behavior. And where the two come together is we need our intelligent brain to raise our awareness, our conscious awareness of those emotional responses we get, and become more intelligent about them. And that essentially means understanding them, recognizing them, and where appropriate, managing them, so that we don't so much react, but we learn to respond. And there's a pause in the middle between stimulus and response. So that's, but it basically means becoming more intelligent about our emotions. And if you look at, way back to Daniel Goleman's first definitions, when he popularized the term, you've got the 4 key elements. You've got self-awareness and self-management, and you've got awareness of others and relationship management. So if we were to categorize it into 4 key areas, it's self-awareness, self-management, awareness of others, and relationship management, which is the practical application of those awarenesses.
It's in the organizational setting, does it significantly, in your view, inside organizations versus in our day-to-day non-organized lives, at home, in the street, in social settings? So is there a distinction largely? Are we looking about exactly the same self-awareness and awareness of others phenomenon?
So the internal regulation and proactive management of your emotional intelligence relies on the same mechanisms, right? Which we can perhaps talk about later. What's different in our home life or our friendship life compared to our work life will, of course, be the external stimuli. Different people, different context, and ultimately what's really triggering our emotional responses or reactions to things is that external stimuli. And we will have certain beliefs that get triggered. The core of changing and developing our emotional intelligence over time is to become more aware of our belief systems and how they then get emotionally triggered. So we'll have beliefs about our work, we'll have beliefs about what good or bad leadership is, those beliefs lead to our perceptions and our expectations. We'll have beliefs about what a happy marriage is, what a father child relationship should be. So whether or not those beliefs, different beliefs about different categories of life, get triggered is obviously specific to the context and where we are. But the regulation, the awareness and the regulation and the management of our emotions, those mechanisms will be the same. They'll just have different triggers from the external world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes sense. That again prompts me to think two aspects to the whole emotional intelligence from a personal point of view. It's is there a hierarchy? Those 4 elements that you mentioned, Daniel Goleman, the self-aware, the self-management, the external awareness, and the external relationships. So those 4 elements, is there a hierarchy in which they need in order for to sit, or does the hierarchy not really matter at all?
Yes, it does matter. And I would say that the most important element of all, because nothing else can be developed or improved upon without this, is self-awareness. You know, if you are, as psychologists have categorized many years ago, unconsciously incompetent at something, so not only are you behaving in an ineffective way, you're not aware you're behaving in an ineffective way, then you don't even have any conscious awareness that there's something to change. So self-awareness, and I often talk about brutal honesty with ourselves. We have to be honest about where we are as a starting point, where we need to develop, where we get our emotionally unintelligent reactions. Because if we don't have that, whatever we do to try to learn how to manage that or become more aware of others or manage our relationships, well, we don't even get to those steps, because it's a little bit like if you came to me, Paul, and said, I'd like to improve my presentation skills. And I say, okay, where are you at, in your opinion, on a scale of 1 to 10? And you say, well, I'm a 9. I'm really good at this. And I watch you give a presentation. And, you know, having done this for years, I'm evaluating you a 2. Unless we can help you become more self-aware of the reality, you're not going to ever desire any change or see a need for change. You'll be conscious that there is something to develop here. So I'd say self-awareness is number 1. And then number 2, you can call it self-management. I often refer to it as self-regulation, is probably second in the hierarchy. Because before we can start to really focus on the quality of our interactions in relationships, we've got to start with ourselves. We've got to learn to be more aware, and we've got to learn to regulate. And if necessary, over time, we've got to challenge and change some of our outdated belief systems, which are ultimately triggering our reactions in the first place. So I would say those 2 are the most important, particularly self-awareness to begin with.
Yeah, and intuitively, that makes total sense. You know, if we go to the organization, just into the organizational setting, in your experience, is it on a scale of 1 to 10? Generally, organizations, are they more positively intelligent, or the people in the organizations, or are they less emotionally intelligent, non-intelligent? Where do organizations fall the 1 to 10 emotionally intelligent scale, do you think?
The fact that I've been pretty busy for 30 years and there's a huge demand for what I do indicates that there's definitely room for improvement here. And of course, there are exceptions to this. You know, throughout my career, I've literally worked with thousands of leaders, and I'm mainly working at kind of CEO, general manager, or director level. That's probably 90% of my clients. And literally, we are going into thousands and thousands of clients over the years. I would say those that are highly emotionally intelligent and are getting great business results, and, you know, they're meeting all the targets, the bottom line, they probably fall into 5% of those people. And then the second biggest category is those that may be ticking boxes. They may be, you know, meeting the KPIs, the key performance indicators. They may be keeping the shareholders happy, but there's a price, because their emotionally unintelligent behavior is alienating people. It's demotivating people. It's causing a lack of loyalty to the company. People won't go the extra mile. So it's generating a bunch of transactional employees that are in it for the paycheck rather than loyal relational employees, because they feel valued, they feel respected, they feel heard, they feel psychologically safe, they feel supported, and they feel that they're in an environment which nurtures growth. And that's what highly emotionally intelligent leaders can create. So there's a lot of work to be done there still, unfortunately.
two questions immediately spring to mind, though. So if the top 5% are highly emotionally intelligent, and if there's still plenty of scope out there for improvement, for people to reach out, for people aware that they could from some intervention to work their own personal emotional intelligence, or that of their executive management team or whatever, they must have a reasonable degree of self-awareness in the very first instant. That must have already triggered.
Yes and no.
Okay.
So if individuals reach out to me directly themselves and say, I need to work on this, I would agree with your comment. Sadly, again, and this is one of the big challenges I have, what often happens is there is a poor, exasperated HR director that's trying to take care of the people element of an organization, and he or she realizes that there's a problem. They're getting complaints. They're getting low, employee satisfaction surveys. They're seeing higher turnover rates, etc. And they often reach out and say, come and help, please. And what I've often found is I can only really help if the person at the top, so that's normally the CEO or the general manager, and the leadership team gets this, buys into it authentically, not tick box. You can't fake emotional intelligence. It's not. They've got to authentically want to be more emotionally intelligent and create an environment where people thrive. And if we don't get their buy-in, we're going to fail. It's like what I always say with emotionally intelligent behavior is kids don't do what their parents tell them to do. Kids do what their parents do. And it's exactly the same analogy in, employees don't do what their leadership team tell them to do. Here's our new values. Here's our beautiful behavior code. These are the competencies we require of you. No one is going to do that if they don't see authentically those behaviors and those values being lived by the leadership team and the general manager, CEO. Then it fails. It's like, don't tell your kid to not use their mobile phone so much if you're addicted to it yourself. It's not going to work. There's no credibility. It requires
that.
Yeah.
Do you find a lot of disconnect between do as I say versus do as I do? Is that the starting point that you experience a lot?
I definitely do and have. And, I tend to be quite brutally honest with people. If I'm only interested in helping organizations grow, and I do that because I genuinely believe that people have the right to be living and working, which is a lot of our time, in a thriving environment where they can grow. And I also know that if we get to that place, it means loyalty, motivation, and it translates into business results as well. But if I see and I observe senior leaders that are behaving in a toxic way, and I often try to do my research and figure this out in the early stages, I'll tell them in a constructive, emotionally intelligent way, but I won't pretend. And normally at that point, they go, oh, hell, you're right. Wow, thanks for calling me out, or you're fired. We don't want you in this organization. Either way, I'm happy because I would have been wasting my time to try and pursue that if that person wasn't open to developing. And for those that get it, then we can do something. Then we can really make a difference and really nurture and grow that emotionally intelligent culture. But it's got to start at the top.
Yeah, it's so can you give a picture of what an intervention sounds like or looks like from your view? So if I'm the CEO, for example, I'm scratching my head thinking, I thought I had a good strategic plan. I thought I had a good patience thing going with my team, but we're just not producing the results. And I seem to get a bit of negativity going on in the boardroom meetings that I have. And then when I go to the exec to get a bit of pushback, I thought I was doing everything fine. So how do you intervene then? What's the profession in that type of scenario?
There is no one size fits all, but I can definitely share with you a typical process. So, there are some organizations that just want an entertainer and nothing's going to change. And, they'll say, come in and do a motivational talk. We've got our 60 senior managers coming together from around the world this summer. And I'll say, great, but it will just be entertainment. And maybe, we're not going to create a great change there. But that's not my preferred way of working, even though I'm happy to do that as long as we're realistic about expectations, right? But a typical intervention, and I tend to work with organizations 1 to even 3 years and to really embed this culture is, first of all, I'll do a proper needs analysis or exploration call, as I call it, to find out what's going on, what's happening on the people level, what evidence they have of that, how it's impacting on turnover rates, bottom line, sales, these kind of things. Then I normally say, okay, let me speak with the leadership team confidentially, one-to-one, all of them, and get each of their views on this, right? And I'm very clear that that's a confidential, that's one of the advantages of being external, that you can do that. And often I'm not bad, let's put it that way, at getting a little bit of truth coming out there. And often it reveals to me some, not necessarily what I've just been told by one person. And then I often say, okay, before we jump in and start creating any kind of development plan here, can I be a fly on the wall? And it's never perfect, right? But I want to see the team. I want to see the people in real life scenarios. I don't want to create a false scenario in a training session where it's role play. Everyone's on best behavior. They know they're being watched or judged. I was like, no, we want some real life business dilemmas. You've got an urgent leadership team meeting next week. You've got to make some decisions. Please let me observe. I won't get involved, but I need to see this team in action and what's really happening. It's still not perfect because they know somebody's observing, but as long as there are real things that need to be decided and decisions, and at least I get a better taste. And then from that kind of diagnosis, I can really see what's going on. And then I'll sit down and say, okay, quite transparently, here's some of the areas that I think are working well. Here's some of the areas that I thought were not so good. Let's focus on this. And then we always set the destination postcard. Where do we want to get to in a year's time? Because realistically, you're not going to get change in a couple of months. And why? What's the benefits to you and your organization? How committed are you? And then we start making a more detailed plan. And that can be anything from monthly online sessions to live events to one-to-one coaching for different leadership team members, any combination of that, depending on budget, commitment, and how we really want to get there. So but that's how we generally start off. That's a typical start.
Martin, this is interesting to try to establish the parallel between this and the intervention of a group facilitator in a meeting.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. What's your experience of that? Is it facilitative in nature or is it expertise driven in nature?
It's facilitative in nature. Well, my initial observations are normally quite quiet, so I can see what's going on. But then if they decide to work with me, I go into very much co-creation facilitator role. So, I can provide the frameworks, I can provide the neuroscience, I can provide the evidence. Quite often that's necessary to get buy-in from people. I'm about to go over in June to do a session with 50 engineers that are very logically minded. So if I start coming in and talking about emotions without scientific credibility and some neuroscience, so I'm going to jump right in with brain science, the different regions of the brain, explaining how they work together, etc. That's just the buy-in. But then after that, I go into, I don't know exactly what the best solutions are for you because it's got to fit into your daily operations. I'm going to give you ownership over it or co-ownership over this, and I'm here to guide you and facilitate you. And I'll call you out in a constructive way if I see examples of toxic or emotionally unintelligent behavior. And then I'll invite you to openly discuss that. So I kind of facilitate, training this in the traditional sense of here's some information. You can't intellectualize this. I can explain it for hours. You asked me to talk about this in all the different models I've got. I could probably be here for 20 hours without stopping. But that doesn't change anything. Especially with a topic like this, it has to be experiential. And ultimately, people have to get to a point relatively early in the journey where they not understand intellectually, but they feel that something is shifting. That's the elephant or the subconscious brain's language. It speaks in feelings. It doesn't speak in logic. So unless they feel the benefits, and that might also mean feeling some discomfort to begin with. And, I'll already say, well, bits of this are going to feel uncomfortable and a little bit brutally honest and out of your comfort zone. And don't worry, I'm going to hold that, but it's likely to happen because we have to go there before we can actually develop this. So that's the brutal honesty part. But it's those feelings that people get, and then ultimately feeling of progress, that is the fuel to really keep the momentum going and generate the change. Because we have to speak the language of the elephant. If we're going to develop emotional intelligence, we can't speak logic or rationale or cognitive language, even though that might get initial curiosity. We've got to work with emotions. We've got to recognize them. And we may as well be speaking Japanese to a Chinese guy if we try to logicize this, if that makes sense. So we have to speak the right language, which is experience and emotions.
Now, it's a really interesting point, Paul. That it's not so much a distinction. It's more what's the correlation between Steve's work and approach versus our understanding of conventional facilitation. So if I was to characterize that distinction from what you just said, Steve, would it be fair to say that your intervention is more process driven over a longer period of time, whereas a conventional facilitation approach is more around singular events? Are you more process driven over time?
Yes. To put that into how that's translated practically, I've never really done a day of marketing or sales in my life. I got a gig 30 years ago where I was invited to teach emotional intelligence on an executive MBA program. And that's all the marketing sales I've ever done. Because from that, I got like 5 or 6 big clients. And many of those people, those clients are still my clients 30 years later. And that already gives an answer to the question that I'm very long-term vision, global process focused. I can do the short entertainment because that's all it is. I can do the short intervention, but we've all experienced, right? We go away, we have a couple of days at a nice hotel with the leadership team, or if we want to bribe our staff, and I'm sorry to use such a harsh word, we give them a big extravaganza for summer. We take them to a plush place. We show them how much we care about them. We get somebody like me come in and give a motivational talk, and then it's forgotten a week later. We spent a huge amount of money on it. That's not really where we're going to get any meaningful change here. And that's definitely not what gets me out of bed in the morning. I'm not really interested in that.
Martin, this reminds me about Keith Jones' style of intervention. We are getting a pattern here where group facilitation
Yes.
is really being surpassed by long-term intervention strategies designed by practitioners who actually understand more about human nature rather than group nature.
Yes,
Yeah, and it's in some ways
that makes.
it's a combination of both. I think, is it that it sounds, Steve, like the initial trigger for the intervention is the individual, and then the group dynamic and the group facilitation comes out of those initial individuals. Or does it work the other way around? Or can it work both ways?
It more the former, more your first suggestion there, actually, Martin. I think that's probably 90% of the cases from my career, certainly. Yeah.
It's can I bring in towards the area, the point to like to focus on, which is the organizational meetings part of it. So from your experience, where do you see meetings fitting into the diagnosis, the application, the use interventions? Where do meetings fit into the process of enhancing or improving emotional intelligence throughout the organization?
Meetings are a typical place where we see emotionally intelligent, or sadly more often than not emotionally unintelligent behaviors, right? And so I see this as an absolutely key example. And what's often going on in meetings is what I call ego tennis. So if we look at another way of explaining emotional intelligence, we can look at the ego. Now, the ego, as a construct, which is false, it's subjective, and it's a story we tell ourselves. Each of us forms an identity, which is a whole bunch of beliefs, right? So, and then once we form that identity, we start to behave in a way that is true to that identity. So what happens is we have a belief, and that will trigger a pattern of the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we behave, which, by the way, is just an energetic exchange, because thoughts are electrical energy, feelings or emotions are chemical changes, they're chemical energy, and actions, the way in which we behave, are kinetic energy. And energy can't be created or destroyed. It's a universal law of physics. It can only be converted. So the ego, what happens is something happens in the external world. It stimulates us based on our belief filter. So if we have a certain strong belief that is, adamant that a certain right-wing policy is correct, and somebody says or does something that's extremely left-wing, it triggers our belief, which then we get an emotional hijack. We start thinking, what an asshole, I can't work with this guy. And then if we allow it to come out into behavior, what the hell are you talking about? All right. Now, what happens in a meeting is we have a clash of these egos, because, you got a meeting of 10 people, you got 10 different identities, hundreds of different belief systems, and triangles of emotion, thinking, and behavior. And what I often see in meetings is what I described previously as ego tennis. So what tends to happen is, first of all, you tend to have 2 or 3 dominant people in those meetings. I'm talking about leadership teams. So it'll be the ones with the most power, the one with the biggest voice, the one with the strongest ego, and he or she and their opponents, they tend to do most of the talking. And what happens in ego tennis is somebody suggests an idea, right? Which is often why we're in a meeting, to discuss things and find solutions. That triggers the belief system and therefore activates the ego of someone else. And he or she responds by jumping into the game of tennis and hitting the ball back. So, and once the game starts, you're wrong, I disagree. Once the game starts, then you're into winner or loser, because somebody's going to win that rally at the end of it, right? That's the nature of tennis. The emotionally intelligent people, even if they hear something that might even trigger them, or initially they get an emotional response that they disagree with, they press their pause button, and rather than immediately hitting the ball back, they resist the game of tennis and they get curious. And they say things like, well, okay, that's an interesting perspective, Paul. Could you tell me more? Or so they go into a place of curiosity and search for understanding rather than instant dismissal and ego tennis games. And of course, what happens is in team norms, a pattern develops. And, you know, this is one of the things I initially spot when I do my initial observations of teams to find out what's going on. You know, I'll point out, are you aware that Igor and Anastasia in that meeting did 90% of the talking? It was an hour meeting and they spoke for 90% of the time. Are you aware that 3 people didn't speak at all? And are you, and I just point out facts, behavior, you know, factual. And I can almost guarantee that what I've just observed is a pattern that has developed as a norm. It's the same people playing tennis. It's the same win or lose. It's the same egos. And then I talk about egos, managing the ego. And I often use the phrase, is this we-go or ego? Because you're the leadership team. And are you not here to make better improvements for the whole affiliate or organization? Or are you here for 1 or 2 individuals to win over and get what he or she wants? Let's be honest about this, guys, and how do we feel that this ego tennis game happened and Igor and Anastasia spoke for 90% of the time, and most of that time that one of them was trying to prove they were right and the other one was wrong? Because that's a fact. I just observed it. Let's discuss it. And that's why I talk about the brutal honesty, and it might be uncomfortable, but this is the great thing about giving feedback on this as well. You should never ever make a judgment or an assumption or an opinion. You give factual evidence. You spoke for 90% of that meeting, and I timed it, and 3 people never said anything at all. Fact. And most of that was about the 1 point, and then you had to rush for the last 3 minutes to just, tick off the other 3 items on the agenda. What do you think of that, guys? And that's where it becomes interesting. So that's hopefully a clarification of what's often happening in meetings, and partly how you start to make an intervention to challenge it.
Yes, that resonates. And Paul, that's that exact point when we look at 60 and episode number 59. That's the whole concept of dialogue came very much more, and with our previous guests, dialogue was the idea that you're not seeking to engage with another person, win an argument. You're seeking to understand where they're going. That in a nutshell concept dialogue that we kind of bottomed out from those conversations. And I if I'm hearing you correctly, that's partially what you're referring to. The absence of dialogue can actually be a reasonable marker or a reasonable indicator of an absence of emotional intelligence. Would that be a fair
Yes.
observation? Yeah.
Absolutely, I would fully agree with that, Martin. And one of the big things that I try to share with people is emotionally intelligent leaders, that 5% that I've come across in my career who are outstanding at creating a safe environment of growth and abundance, if you like. They're often the silent ones. They're not the ego-driven talkers. Silence is golden. They sit back, they give people space, they get curious, and they ask great questions. I wrote a book 12, 13 years ago called Emotional Intelligence Coaching, and it was it was a guide for how leaders can integrate a coaching style of emotionally intelligent communication into their daily interactions, right? Meetings being one of them. And, you know, if I look at the qualities of a great coach, they're present, so they regulate themselves, they're self-aware, they regulate themselves, even if their own emotions get triggered. They then use the skills of emotionally intelligent behavior towards others. So they're empathic, they're great listeners, they are curious about others, and they ask fantastic questions that help the other person gain understanding and clarity, which perhaps they hadn't already realized. And that's why I often say emotionally intelligent, successful leaders are often very great coaches, because it's the same qualities you see. You know, there's a couple that come to mind that I've worked with who they were mostly silent. I did 1 year, 2 year programs with their teams. If you didn't know the organization and you came in and you had to guess who was the CEO here, you wouldn't have a clue if you went by traditional standards, because it was the person who was quietest in the corner, occasionally chipping in with a really great observation or question. And that in itself encourages people to open up. And if you translate that into a meeting culture where you've got a team of people doing that, of course you need decisions to be made. Of course you need, you know, you can't just discuss everything, but especially in the problem solving stages or the generating idea stages, you need this kind of communication so that everyone speaks up. They're not afraid to, they get a space to be heard, and they get really great questions that helps them to make realizations that perhaps they hadn't realized before. And that's all highly emotionally intelligent behavior, actually.
Yeah, Martin, we are approaching time. We're approaching time.
I think we're out of time. Yeah, the clock catches up, and when we get deep to a conversation here, the time just goes in an instant. It feels like we've actually been chatting for a couple of hours. We've managed about 35 40 minutes. Can I just try to? I'll just try to bring us through a quick summary of some of the key points that I think we touched on there. We opened, I think, as a kind of an obvious question to what is emotional intelligence, and you gave us two guiding points. One, you talked about the basic physiology of the brain, so that there are different parts of the brain that handle emotion versus handle, let's call it, reality. There's different parts then that get triggered by different events. You mentioned Daniel Goleman, maybe the grandfather of emotional intelligence, because I remember reading his book many years ago, and that he was. But you mentioned 4 elements that he would have identified about emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-regulation, awareness of others, and then relationships to work with others. And we then talked about the hierarchy. Are they hierarchical? Largely, we kind of said, yeah, they actually need to be self-aware. Well, then emotional intelligence really apply, because you can't be aware of whether you are or are not being emotionally. Talking of awareness, self-regulation, you pegged both of those as at the top of it. I then asked about the idea of where does the intervention come from, and I thought you mentioned HR sometimes might need to call somebody in to have a word. These are my words, but that's the inference that I took, because I've been in that scenario myself, Steve, on many occasions, when it's not the CEO that gives the call, it's the HR manager going, oh, you know, I need some help with. But then somebody else, if they have good self-awareness, will actually make the call themselves and look for interventions. That then brings us to what's happening in the dynamic that I found really interesting. And that is, workers do what they see, not necessarily what they are told. You use the analogy of our children and use the analogy of the mobile phone on the kitchen table. But key point that we can have all the policies, all the procedures documented, all of the matters written up and put into frames, but you see, and emotional intelligence is really around the behaviors rather than the academic orientation of those ideas. Into that in a little bit of detail to say we can do the entertainment piece. So when the intervention happens, there are two types of intervention that you refer to. Entertainment, tell great jokes, the attention for another. It was a great one. We all went back to the bar afterwards. We stuck around for the next 2 days of the away days. But when we got back to the office, we just carried on doing the same old blather. We kept on repeating the same mistakes. Or the alternative intervention, which I think is the one that you lean to more because you said this. It's more process driven. It's more driven over time. It starts with the individuals. Again, you gave a really interesting sense of how the intervention happens. It'll be a one-to-one with the CEO in the first instance. It'll typically with the key participants in the collective, whatever that collective is. Interestingly, you time to sit back, to observe, to see it in the wild. How are the behaviors interacting? And at that point, then you can either get fired, as you mentioned, or you value in the observations that you provide. So now when the observation made, people are either to engage and that becomes telling. But I suppose that's really where the emotional intelligence development has to start. We're back to the self-awareness piece, aren't we? Because if we're not when you observe as the interventionist, and when you articulate it, people either go, oh, actually fine, or people go, no. And that then brought us to the final part of our conversation, really, where I asked you about meetings and organization meetings. And again, really interesting things. Ego tennis. And you made the point that ego is the most prevalent things that you've observed in where the two egos, the biggest egos in the room, and there might be 10 people in the room, but there might be only 3 doing the headbutting. When the ego tennis starts, the intelligence, the challenge then is people get back from it and become self-aware, become observation, was that the really good, emotionally intelligent CEOs, they see it, they can make the interventions rather than by statements. And 4 key points, I'll wrap it with this, 4 key points that you said at the very end. Self-aware is the first key. Emotionally intelligent towards. That means being facilitative towards others rather than projecting our own ego. The best being curious. Why did somebody react they did? Why did they have the emotional reaction in that I'm not aware of? There is. I need to find that before I react back. That curiosity comes from asking great questions.
Yeah.
I hope that has done some service.
I think
to a really great.
I think you. My compliments, Martin. You absolutely nailed it, and I think there's two visions or purposeful hopes for the future I just want to share just to wrap up. I'll be really brief, right? First of all, one of my passions and one of the things I would love to see is that I didn't need to do this kind of stuff with adults in organizational settings, because this kind of learning was mandatory in every school in the world, right? Running alongside whatever else needs to be taught. And actually, we did have some success with that. I managed to get interest in Lithuania, of all countries, and we had a project where over 80 schools incorporated my emotional intelligence model into their curriculums as mandatory. So I've proved it can be done. And quite often with children, it's not a question of helping them to become more emotionally intelligent. It's stopping them becoming what they naturally already are by generating a lack of emotional intelligence because of the way in which we behave towards them and what they learn. You know, the whole concept there, we wrote a book called Leadership Through the Eyes of a Child, where we got children between the ages of 4 and 10 and 11 to share their wisdom with corporate leaders, and then go on to teach them how to be more emotionally intelligent. And that worked really well, right? Because kids have already got it until we teach them not to have it. My second vision, and this is the real theme of my second vision, is the reality is we don't have that situation right now. And I just released a book called The Ripple Revolution, which is based on quantum physics as well as the neuroscience of emotional intelligence. And it, you know, I think we can all agree, you just need to look around the world. There are some pretty, in many cases, sociopathic, psychopathic leaders out there that are creating a lot of mayhem in the world. We don't mention any names, let's not get political, but we know it's a bit of a mess out there, right? And my take on that is, we can complain about that, we can go down that energetic rabbit hole and get drawn into it, or we can say, well, I've only got so much energy, and a big driver behind my energy, one of the three energies I mentioned, is my emotional energy, and that translates into how I think and how I behave. Let's create more and more conscious, emotionally intelligent leaders that only want to do good in the world. They want to succeed with their product or service, but that product or service is serving humanity or the planet or both. There's no losers in that. And how do we do that? Well, we do that 1 minute, one breath at a time. If each leader takes responsibility for becoming more self-aware and regulating him or herself and showing up more of the time with the right energetic ripples, we all know, right? If we're in a room with a highly toxic person, we come away feeling down, drained, energetically exhausted. But conversely, if we're in a space with someone that's energetically aware, empathic, kind, coming from a place of love rather than fear, we get inspired, we get energized. That is the ripple effect, and quantum physics can now explain what's actually happening there. And my other big passion, therefore, is to create more of those kind of leaders that will ultimately lead us to creating the kind of world that we really want to leave behind to our children and our grandchildren. That's a couple of things I wanted to share at the end, but these are really relevant to this topic. So
that's really amazing, Steve. Martin, thank you so much for these moments. We spend here, we could be spending here hours and nurturing ourselves with the wisdom from Steve. And Martin, as always, a brilliant summary. Thank you so much. I think our viewers are going to enjoy thoroughly this episode, 61 episode. And again, it was really a pleasure. And let's stay in touch, as I think Steve can be, probably Martin, and this is a suggestion, hosted with Keith Jones. I would love to see these two together, and thinking about how to deconstruct group facilitation, right? Because we don't need group facilitation. We need, as colleagues in the IAF are now saying, the small F facilitator, the facilitator that intervenes inside the organization permanently, right?
absolutely. So it was a pleasure, gentlemen. Thank you so much, and I'm always open to any future sessions. So please reach out if that would be useful.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Steve,
much.
thanks a million for your
Martin,
time and your
Steve.
expertise. Really enjoyed it.
Okay, take care, guys, and yeah, let me know what we do next, and let me know what's happening. All right, so I'm going to say bye for now then. All right.
Bye for now. Bye for now, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Welcome to Talk to Your Meeting Doctors, the LinkedIn Live series from My Meeting Support, featuring Dr. Martin Duffy and Dr. Paul Nunesdea.